of the cells in the eye, the so-called melanopsin cells that set the central circadian clock. So he was a pioneer in that field, which led him to be a pioneer in this field, and so on. When should that 8-hour window be placed within each 24-hour cycle? Well, let's talk about ideal. Ideal, if you really want to maximize all the health benefits of time-restricted feeding, you need to extend the fast around sleep on both sides. You would place it smack dab in the middle of the day. It would be a schedule in which you started eating, for instance, at 10 a.m. and you stopped eating at 6 p.m. An absolutely dreadful schedule for anyone that wants to have some semblance of a normal life. In my opinion, it's not really compatible with most schedules, although some people might be able to do it. Maybe you and your family or your friends, you're eating a late breakfast and then you're having a late-ish lunch around 2 p.m. and then you have dinner at 6. And then assuming that you go to bed around 9:30 or 10 p.m., that is going to extract the maximum amount of weight-related, body fat-related, metabolic factor-related aspects of time-restricted feeding. Some people tend to fall into a category where they do best placing that feeding window later in the day, and provided it doesn't run too close to your sleep. Remember, you need a 2 or 3 hour buffer before your sleep where you're not ingesting anything. That's in order to extract the benefits of time-restricted feeding. Well, then starting your feeding window at 12 p.m. and ending it at 8 p.m., plus or minus half an hour or so, day to day, seems like a perfectly reasonable schedule. For some people, starting at 2 p.m. and ending at 10 p.m. will be that schedule. Of course, you have to take into consideration when you exercise, if you exercise. For instance, I like to exercise early in the day if I run or if I do some moderate or light intensity exercise, regardless of what type of exercise it is. I have no trouble waiting until my feeding window kicks in around noon or even 2 p.m. But if I do high intensity weight training, for instance, early in the day, or if I run sprints and I do that at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., by 11 a.m. I am very, very hungry. And it's hard for me to do other things, concentrate, etc. Now, I'm not neurotic about my feeding window. As I mentioned before, I kind of let it expand and contract a bit around the 8-hour mark and feel perfectly free to do that too. We're talking here in ideals, not in necessarily practicals. But other people find that they're very hungry when they wake up early in the day. If you're one of these people, or you're somebody who really is trying to emphasize hypertrophy or maintenance of muscle, then it does seem that ingesting protein early in the day is beneficial, that it can be more readily converted into muscle tissue. And this has been demonstrated in at least one study. There's another study underway that's exploring this further. For people that are really, really interested in hypertrophy and building muscle, well, then time-restricted feeding is usually not the way they go. I mean, let's be honest. There are many people out there who are eating 4 or more meals per day, and they're doing that from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. I realize that not everybody is overweight. There is an obesity crisis. Indeed, the percentage of obesity and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is just cosmic through the roof, at least in this country and in other countries as well. This country meaning the U.S., but other countries as well. But there are, of course, people that are trying to gain weight who don't want to lose weight, or who are trying to maximize physical performance or hypertrophy or things of that sort. And so, of course, time-restricted feeding for them might be as long as I'm awake, I'm eating. And I tip my hat to those people and just say, provided you understand what you're doing and the burden that places on some of the other processes in your body, if that's right for you, then by all means pursue that. Another thing that we can add to this summary or key points related to time-restricted feeding is the use of glucose disposal agents and or behaviors. If you find that you've eaten too close to a period of time in which you would prefer to be fasting, that's when a 30-minute brisk walk or even modest walk after eating can be beneficial. Ingesting some lemon juice or lime juice can help lower blood glucose somewhat. And then there are the things like metformin and berberine. There are even some supplements out there that combine things like berberine, cinnamon, which can lower blood glucose, and things like chromium and things that have a mild effect on blood glucose. But berberine and metformin are very high potency glucose disposal agents. And I mentioned earlier why you would want to approach those with the appropriate level of caution and figure out the dosages for you. And for some people, the dosages will be 0 milligrams is going to be ideal. And then, of course, we discussed how making sure that you're ingesting enough fluids, in particular water and salt, especially if you're using caffeine in order to increase your levels of alertness, regardless of where that caffeine source comes from, coffee, tea, or otherwise. That can cause the excretion of sodium and can lead to a kind of shakiness, a lightheadedness, and the feelings of hunger that may or may not be related to blood glucose. Some people genuinely need to eat. I certainly would not want to see people getting hypoglycemic to the point where it's dangerous. Certainly if you are diabetic, and in fact for all people, you should consult with your physician when exploring any major changes to diet or additions or subtractions of anything, including supplementation. But for most people, maintaining relatively low to modest blood glucose levels is going to be pretty healthy and will allow all the positive effects of intermittent fasting to occur. And when you find that reaching that start to the feeding window is challenging, that ingesting sodium can often stabilize your system mentally and physically and allow you to reach that window, often painlessly. And then as a final point, as I mentioned earlier, provided that they are consumed in low, no, or modest amounts, artificial sweeteners or plant-based non-sugar, non-caloric sweeteners don't seem to really impact blood glucose to the extent that it would, quote unquote, take you out of your fast. But that, like fat fasting, is something that's going to be highly individual and that you're going to have to experiment with for yourself. And being able to recognize when you're in a fast and when you're out of a fast at a subjective level and not constantly having to measure your blood glucose or do things of that sort can be beneficial. And I think if you watch for the feelings associated with eating and post-eating foods of different kinds and different amounts, and you watch for the feelings associated with being fasted for long periods of time or short periods of time, of having gotten sufficient sunlight, of having trained hard or not trained hard earlier that day, etc., you can do the most important thing, which is to start to learn to evaluate your own system, to run simple, safe experiments on your system in a way that allows you to really establish the ideal nutrition schedule for you, whether it be time-restricted feeding, aka intermittent fasting, or some other nutrition. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That really helps us. In addition, please feel free to leave us comments about this episode or other episodes. If you want to make suggestions about future episode guests or episode topics, please do that in the comment section as well. Please also subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. And on Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review.
Are you kidding me?
In addition, if you're not already following Huberman Lab on Instagram, there I do brief posts about science that often are not covered on the podcast. So that's Huberman Lab on Instagram. We're also on Twitter, also at Huberman Lab. Recently, we launched a Clips channel, Huberman Lab Clips. Please check out our Clips channel and subscribe there for brief excerpts from the various Huberman Lab podcasts. In addition, please check out our sponsors that we mentioned at the beginning of this episode. That's a terrific way to support the podcast. We also have a Patreon, patreon.com/Andrew Huberman, and there you can support the podcast at any level that you like. During this episode and in many other previous episodes, I discussed supplements. One issue with supplements and the supplement industry as a whole is that the quality and amounts of supplements often varies tremendously. Therefore, we've partnered with Thorne, Thorne, because Thorne has the absolute highest levels of stringency with respect to the quality of ingredients and the amount of the ingredients matching what's on the label. If you want to see what I take and get 20% off any of Thorne's supplements, you can go to Thorne, Thorne.com/U/Huberman. You'll see the list of supplements that I take. You can get 20% off those. And if you enter the Thorne site through that portal, you can get 20% off anything that Thorne makes. I know we covered a lot of information today. I hope you learned a lot about time-restricted feeding. I hope you learned a lot about metabolism and energy and health and how when you eat is as important as what you eat. And last but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.
to catch my breath.
Welcome. Fate will find you.
Oh no, das ist no, is it because that was
Pointless.
tror ikke, jeg har noget craft, så vi kan finde et eller andet. Hvorfor ramte jeg? Holy shit. Burst. Jeg skal huske det her.
Just need a moment to catch my breath.
Hello. Fate will find you.
Jeg skal se det.
Just need a moment.
Oh, ja, lieber Kollege. Ah, klar. One day. Oh, good. Wait your turn.
Just need a moment to catch my breath.
Oh, cool. Chill. Oh, got it again.
Good day.
Ja.
the brown note if a mirror drops. So
Hello.
I mean, that's cool as fuck. Good for her. But
Welcome to the Huberman. Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today, we are going to talk all about dopamine and what drives you.
Oh my god,
to do
I
the
got
things
it
that you
forgotten.
do.
I forgot about
We're
it.
going to talk about motivation
No.
and desire and craving, but also how dopamine relates to satisfaction and our feelings of well-being. And of course, any discussion about dopamine has to include a discussion about the potential for dopamine-induced addiction. Indeed, dopamine lies at the heart of addiction to all things. But today we are mainly going to focus on how what we do and how we do it and how we conceptualize those things leads to changes in this amazing molecule in our brain and bodies that we call dopamine. I'm going to teach you what dopamine is and what it is not. There are a lot of myths about the molecule dopamine. We often hear about so-called dopamine hits. Today we are going to dispel many common myths about dopamine, and we are going to talk about how dopamine actually works. We're going to discuss the biology of dopamine, the psychology. We will discuss some neural circuits, and a really exciting aspect of dopamine biology are so-called dopamine schedules. In other words, we are going to discuss how things like food, drugs, caffeine, pornography, even some plant-based compounds can change our baseline levels of dopamine, and in doing so, they change how much dopamine we are capable of experiencing from what could be very satisfying events or events that make us feel not so good because of things that we did or took prior. So I promise you it's going to be a vast discussion, but I will structure it for you, and you'll come away with a deep understanding of really what drives you. You will also come away with a lot of tools how to leverage dopamine so that you can sustain energy, drive, and motivation for the things that are important to you over long periods of time. Before we dive into the meat of today's discussion, I'd like to share with you a fascinating result that really underscores what dopamine is capable of in our brains and bodies, and underscores the fact that just through behaviors, no drugs, nothing of that sort, just through behaviors, we can achieve terrifically high increases in dopamine that are very long and sustained in ways that serve us. This is a result that was published in the European Journal of Physiology. I'll go into it in more detail later, but essentially what it involved is having human subjects get into water of different temperatures. So it was warm water, moderately cool water, and cold water. Had them stay in that water for up to an hour, and they measured, by way of blood draw, things like cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine. What was fascinating is that cold water exposure led to very rapid increases in norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is also just called adrenaline. It also led to increases in dopamine, and these increases in dopamine were very significant. They kicked in around 10 or 15 minutes after submersion into the cold water, and I should mention the head wasn't below water, it was just up to the neck. And the dopamine release continued to rise and rise and rise, and eventually reached 250% above baseline. Now, what was interesting is after subjects got out of this cold water, that dopamine increase was sustained. And I know nowadays many people are interested in using cold water therapy as a way to increase metabolism and fat loss, but also to improve sense of well-being, improve cognition, improve clarity of mind. There's something really special about this very alert but calm state of mind. That seems to be the one that's optimal for pretty much everything except sleep. But for all aspects of work and for social engagement and for sport, that highly alert but calm state of mind really is the sweet spot that I believe most of us would like to achieve. And this cold water exposure, done correctly, really can help people achieve that state of mind through these increases in dopamine that last a very long time. So I will later detail the specifics of that study, what it entailed in terms of how long the variations that different subjects experienced, as well as how to limit the amount of stress hormone, cortisol, that's released as a consequence of the cold water. And we will also talk about compounds, supplements that people can take in order to increase their levels of dopamine, should they choose. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Roka. Roka makes sunglasses and eyeglasses that are of the absolute highest quality. I've spent a lifetime working on the visual system. I can tell you that the visual system has to go through a lot of work in order to maintain clarity of what you see when there are shadows, when you go into different types of indoor lighting and so on. And a lot of glasses don't work well because you put them on and then you're in bright light and you can see fine, but then you move into a shadow and then you have to take them off and they don't adjust or they don't adjust quickly enough. With Roka, their eyeglasses and sunglasses are designed with the visual system biology in mind, so you always see things with perfect clarity. The glasses are also terrific because they're very lightweight, and they won't slip off your face if you're exercising, if you're running or biking. In fact, they were designed for the purpose of being able to be worn while you're engaging in those sorts of activities or simply working at your desk. I happen to wear readers at night when I drive or when I work, and I love their sunglasses because I can wear them anywhere.
I am ready to be one shot.
Of their sunglasses and eyeglasses are terrific. Unlike a lot of other performance glasses that frankly make people look like cyborgs, the aesthetics on Rokas are really terrific. You could wear them anywhere you'd like to go. If you'd like to try Roka glasses, you can go to roka.com, that's ROKA.com, and enter the code Huberman to save 20% off your first order. That's Roka, ROKA.com, enter the code Huberman at checkout. Today's podcast is also brought to us by Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. I'm a big believer in getting regular blood work done. And now with the advent of modern DNA tests, you can also analyze your DNA to see what you ought to be doing for your immediate and long-term health. We hear a lot these days about optimization, optimizing hormones, optimizing your metabolism, optimizing this, optimizing that. But unless you know the measurements of metabolic factors, hormones, and other things that are in your blood and DNA, you don't know what to optimize. With Inside Tracker, it makes all of that very easy. They can come to your house to take the blood and DNA test, or you can go to a nearby clinic. They send you the information, and you take those results, and unlike a lot of laboratories doing blood work out there and DNA tests, they have a simple platform, a dashboard that walks you through your results and helps you identify what sorts of nutritional or behavioral or other types of practices you might want to incorporate into your life in order to positively impact your immediate and long-term health. It's a very easy system to use, and you will gain a ton of information simply by doing that test, whether or not you end up making changes to what you're doing or not. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 25% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Just use the code Huberman at checkout. Today's episode is also brought to us by Headspace. Headspace is a meditation app backed by 25 published studies and has over 600,000 five-star reviews. I've been meditating for a long time, but I confess sometimes I meditate and sometimes I am very inconsistent about my meditation. Ideally, I would meditate every day for 20 or 30 minutes.
Huberman.
But what I've found over the years is that
This
I'll
is
start a
too
meditation
much, Ed.
practice, and then as life gets more stressful, I'd like to announce that there's an event that some of you may find very useful. This is an event put on by Logitech that I will be speaking at. It's called of. Most people have heard of dopamine, and we hear all the time now about dopamine hits. But actually, there's no such thing as a dopamine hit. And actually, the way that your body uses dopamine is to have a baseline level of dopamine, meaning an amount of dopamine that's circulating in your brain and body all the time. And that turns out to be important for how you feel generally, whether or not you're in a good mood, motivated, etc. And you also can experience peaks in dopamine above baseline. Now, this has a very specific name in the neurobiology literature. so-called tonic and phasic release of dopamine. And I'll explain what that means in a couple of minutes. But if you remember nothing else from this episode, please remember this, that when you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. Okay, so these peaks in dopamine, they influence how much dopamine will generally be circulating afterward. And you might think, oh, a big peak in dopamine, after that, I'm going to feel even better because I just had this great event. Not the case. What actually happens is that your baseline level of dopamine drops. And I will explain the precise mechanism for that. Okay, in the neuroscience literature, we refer to this as tonic and phasic release of dopamine. Tonic being the low-level baseline that's always there circulating, released into your brain all the time. And then phasic, these peaks that ride above that baseline. And those two things interact. And this is really important. I'm going to teach you the underlying neurobiology, but even if you have no background in biology, I promise to make it all clear. I'll explain the terms and what they mean. And I'm excited to teach you about dopamine because dopamine has everything to do with how you feel right now as you're listening to this. It has everything to do with how you will feel an hour from now. It has everything to do with your level of motivation and your level of desire and your willingness to push through effort. If ever you've interacted with somebody who just doesn't seem to have any drive, they've given up, or if you've interacted with somebody who seems to have endless drive and energy, what you are looking at there in those two circumstances is without question a difference in the level of dopamine circulating in their system. There will be other factors too, but the level of dopamine is the primary determinant of how motivated we are, how excited we are, how outward-facing we are, and how willing we are to lean into life and pursue things. Dopamine is what we call a neuromodulator. Neuromodulators are different than neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are involved in the dialogue between neurons, nerve cells, and neurotransmitters tend to mediate local communication. Just imagine two people talking to one another at a concert. That communication between them is analogous to the communication carried out by neurotransmitters, whereas neuromodulators influence the communication of many neurons. Imagine a bunch of people dancing where it's a coordinated dance involving 10 or 20 or hundreds of people. Neuromodulators are coordinating that dance. In the nervous system, what this means is that dopamine release changes the probability that certain neural circuits will be active and that other neural circuits will be inactive. Okay? So it modulates a bunch of things all at once. And that's why it's so powerful at shifting not just our levels of energy, but also our mindset, also our feelings of whether or not we can or cannot accomplish something. So how does dopamine work and what does it do? Well, first of all, it is not just responsible for pleasure. It is responsible for motivation and drive, primarily at the psychological level. Also for craving. Those three things are sort of the same, motivation, drive, and craving. It also controls time perception. And we will get deep into how dopamine can modulate time perception and how important it is that everybody be able to access increases in dopamine at different time scales. This turns out to be important to not end up addicted to substances, but it also turns out to be very important to sustain effort and be a happy person over long periods of time, which I think most everybody wants. It certainly is adaptive in life to be able to do that. Dopamine is also vitally important for movement. I'll explain the neural circuits for dopamine and mindset and dopamine in movement in a moment, but in diseases like Parkinson's, or Lewy body's dementia, which is similar to Parkinson's in many ways, there's a depletion or death of dopamine neurons at a particular location in the brain, which leads to shaky movements, challenges in speaking, challenges in particular in initiating movement, and because dopamine is depleted elsewhere too, people with Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia also experience drops in motivation and affect, meaning mood. They tend to get depressed and so on. When those people are properly treated, they can, not always, but they can recover some fluidity of movement, some ability to initiate movement, and almost without question, those people feel better psychologically, not just because they can move, but also because dopamine impacts mood and motivation. So what are the underlying neural circuits? For those of you that are not interested in biology and specific nomenclature, you can tune out now if you want, but it's actually pretty straightforward. You have two main neural circuits in the brain that dopamine uses in order to exert all its effects. The first one is a pathway that goes from this area in the what's called the ventral tegmentum. That's a fancy, but ventral just means bottom, and tegmentum actually means floor. So it's at the bottom of the brain, and it's the ventral part of the floor, so it's really low in the back of the brain, the ventral tegmentum, and it goes from the ventral tegmentum to what's called the ventral striatum and the prefrontal cortex. Now, that's a lot of language, but basically what we call this is the Mesocorticolimbic Pathway. This is the pathway by which dopamine influences motivation, drive, and craving. It involves structures that some of you may have heard of before, things like nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. This is the pathway that really gets disrupted in addictions, where in particular, drugs that influence the release of dopamine, like cocaine and methamphetamine, we'll talk about those drugs today, they tap into this pathway. But if you are pursuing a partner, a boyfriend or girlfriend, if you're pursuing a degree in school, if you're pursuing a finish line in a race, you are tapping into this so-called Mesocorticolimbic pathway. This is the classic reward pathway in all mammals. The other pathway emerges from an area in the brain called the substantia nigra, so called because the cells in that area are dark, and the substantia nigra connects to an area of the brain called the dorsal striatum. This is, not surprisingly, called the Nigrostriatal Pathway. For those of you who have never done any neuroanatomy, I'm going to teach you a little trick right now. Everything in neuroanatomy, the first part of a word tells you where the neurons are. And then the second part tells you where they are connecting to. So when I say nigrostriatal pathway, it means that the neurons are in substantia nigra and they connect to the striatum, nigrostriatal pathway. So while it's a lot of language, there is some logic there. Okay. So we've got these two pathways, one mainly for movement, right? This is the substantia nigra to dorsal striatum. And we've got this other pathway, the so-called mesocorticolimbic pathway, that's for reward, reinforcement, and motivation. I want you to remember that there are two pathways. If you don't remember the two pathways in detail, that's fine. But please remember that there are two pathways, because that turns out to be important later. Now, the other thing to understand about dopamine is that